my presentation to kick off the conference is really to look at 3 failures, as I call it, and 1 future. The one failure is on climate change. Both Anumita and I were at the Rio conference in 1992. The world has been struggling to cut CO2 emissions since the early 90s. It's still struggling. We believe action is too little, it's too late, and the world is at risk. There is also the second failure, the second big story that brings us back home, which is the story of pollution in Delhi. We started cutting emissions in Delhi also in the 90s. We brought in what we believe are very important first generation reforms. These brought relief, cut emissions, but the scourge is back again. And the city and its people are at risk once again. And then there is the third, which is the clean energy access for all. I began my work with Anil Agarwal, Anil, in whose name we do these dialogues every year. I started my work with Anil, traveling across rural India, looking at his obsession, which was how to do improved cook stoves and energy access for the very poor of India. At that time, and many of you would remember, the entire talk in the world was the other energy crisis. Everybody was talking about how would we actually meet the needs of clean energy of millions who stayed outside the commercial energy sector. And yet, when we meet again 30 years later, women in the world are still cooking on inefficient, dirty stoves, and they are at risk. So there are 3 failures that the world has: climate change, our own failure of air pollution, and then the issue of energy and compromise of women's health. The question that we are asking in this dialogue is, can these 3 failures be turned into an opportunity? Can we find a way to move ahead together? Let's look at the first. 1991, our position, when we put together, we said it's an unequal world and it's unequal emissions. We said the poor are not responsible for climate change, they are the victims of climate change. We demanded at that time, Anil and I wrote a publication in which we said we need to differentiate between the luxury emissions of the rich and the survival emissions of the poor. At that stage, methane emissions were becoming a big issue, and we said that you cannot equate the rice fields of the animals of the poor with the diesel SUVs of the rich. And as you will see in my presentation, this is back again on the agenda today. And we said then that the important focus has to be on CO2, on carbon dioxide, mitigation, and sharing that growth between nations and between people. So it's not just about reinventing growth, but it's about sharing that growth between nations, because that's what climate change is about. It's about how we will continue to live in one world, one planet. We put together this book, Global Warming in an Unequal World, a Case of Environmental Colonialism, way back in 1991. And yet, if you look at it now, this is the graph that went mysteriously missing in the latest IPCC report. If you look at it now, then not only has the world not reduced its emissions, the rich world, it's actually managed successfully to export its emissions to the part of the world which does manufacturing. So if you add up the emissions of Chinese, of Europeans, with the consumption that they have of the goods that are manufactured in China or India, then you find that whether it is Europe or the US doesn't even bother to make a claim that it's reduced emissions. So no point in even talking about that. But let's say even Europe, then you do not even still begin then you understand that the world is seriously lagging behind reduction of real, meaningful CO2 emissions. And that's the big failure that we are looking at. The second issue, of course, is the one closer to home, which is tiny particles in Delhi. when Anumita, Anil and I began the work in 90s on air pollution in Delhi, Delhi was enveloped by very dirty air. Pretty much what you see now, but it was blacker and dirtier. We began on what we said, the right to clean air. We raised the issue of PM 2.5, PM 10 emissions, saying that we were inhaling these were deadly, we cannot breathe, and that we needed to make sure that the health costs are recognized. We put out an ad like this: roll down the window of your bulletproof car, Mr. Prime Minister. The security threat is not the gun, it is the air of Delhi. And at that stage, we had given the Prime Minister a clear charter of what we needed to do. And as you will see here, diesel emissions pop out there as well, saying, way back in the late 90s, saying, reduce the use of diesel because that's what's killing us. We also at that stage gave the Prime Minister's home phone number and fax number, and it did create a fair amount of fuss in the morning, early morning at 5 o'clock. We did get a lot of pushback. This was the affidavit that was put out by a major car manufacturer in the Supreme Court, and I think some of the words there will be very amusing to all of us who have now got 10 to 15 years of experience. We know today that tiny particles are deadly. We know today that tiny particles, PM10, PM2.5, PM1, is something that we should not be inhaling. And yet, at that stage in 1999, this was the affidavit that was filed that said, I deny that particulate matter is rising to high levels or that it has a special adverse health impacts. I deny that the smaller the particle, the more harmful it is. So there was huge pressure to say that this story of dirty air and its impact on health is simply a work of fiction. It does not exist. And yet, we prevailed. All of us here had an impact. The Supreme Court listened. We made a difference. CNG was introduced. And more than that, dirty fuel was cleaned up. So on one hand, we got a leapfrog option from CNG, which was giving us emissions which were much cleaner than what we would have had if we had taken the incremental route to clean up diesel. On the other hand, diesel was also cleaned up. And if you look at this, we went from Euro 0. We had 10,000 parts per million of sulfur in our petrol and diesel in 1996. By 1999, against the wishes of the automobile industry and against the wishes of even the Ministry of Petroleum at that stage, we moved from 10,000 to 500. We jumped. We leapfrogged. We got major clean air benefits. And at that stage, we did see stars. We saw cleaner air. If you look at this data, you will see the top line is the trend, which would have happened if we had not got the clean diesel or clean CNG. The bottom is where we were. And there is enough studies now to show that we had huge health benefits as well, whether it is the CPCB study, World Bank study, whatever, to show that all this actually translated into health benefits for people. But 2015, and that's where we are today, vehicle numbers have imploded in the city. Diesel is up, toxic emissions are up. If you look at this graph, you will see we were holding steady for a while, and then steadily each year Delhi's air pollution has gone up, whether it is NOx, whether it is PM10. It's not just Delhi, it's across India. We know today from the data that we have, and there is a major challenge of also monitoring air pollution across the region, but whatever data that there is shows us that actually more and more cities in India have their health compromised because of polluted air and because of PM10. The third challenge is clean energy, which, as you will all accept, is a fundamental right of everybody. In 1980s, there was a huge concern for cooking energy, as I said earlier. The issue was firewood. The issue was really about the environment. The issue was about inefficient stoves. And the world was really looking at it in terms of what would all this need of a lot of poor people do to the forests of the world. But very soon, I think we began to see the woods from trees. And I always feel very proud of knowing Kirk, who's somewhere around here. He's the one who brought in the first air monitor to show Anil and me way back, I think 1980, 82, and monitored the air inside our offices and essentially brought to focus the issue of indoor air pollution. But more importantly for him was not indoor of Nehru Place, of CSC, but actually the indoor air pollution of poor women in the world. And so we began to understand that it was women who were worst impacted, not just the forest. They were exposed to deadly pollution when cooking on inefficient biomass stove, and the way ahead then was improved cook stoves. And yet, I call this another one of the world's wicked problems. The fact is that in the last few decades, we have done everything. But the one thing we have not been able to do is that rural India has not been able to shift from firewood to LPG. Just take a minute on this graph and you will see. Urban India used firewood 30% in 1993-94. It is down today to 17. Most of urban India today cooks on LPG. And yet if you look at this, from 1993-94, this is NSSO data in India to 2009-10. Look at this. 78.4% of rural India cooked on using biomass on inefficient, dirty, polluting stoves. 76.3% of rural India continues to cook on dirty, inefficient stoves. So clearly it's a wicked, wicked problem, and we need to do something about it. So this is really where we are standing today. 3 failures, 1 opportunity. And the opportunity is that science is now beginning to differentiate between what is a long life pollutant and a short life pollutant. So on one hand, you have CO2, carbon dioxide, which a life of over 100 years, once emitted into the atmosphere, it stays. It's very difficult to clean up. And this is why there is a huge historical burden that the rich countries of the world have. Because of their growth, they have essentially borrowed from the future. They have borrowed by emitting much beyond their share of emissions that are in the atmosphere, which are the cause of climate change today. Because it is the stock of emissions which are today leading to temperature increase. So the world needs to reduce emissions fast. It cannot keep adding because this will determine our future. Carbon dioxide emissions have to be cut. This is non-negotiable. But on the other hand, there is also an understanding that we have what is known as short-lived climate pollutants. Climate scientists, invariably men, love to give acronyms. And acronyms essentially make sure that the rest of us look foolish because we don't understand what they're saying. But one such new acronym, which we should learn very quickly, is SLCP, short-lived climate pollutants. Essentially pollutants which have a very small life as compared to carbon dioxide, few hours to 20 years, but they add to warming when they're in the atmosphere. So they don't have that huge challenge because once emitted can't get cleaned up, but when they're in the atmosphere, they add to warming. So what we are learning is that SLCPs, short-lived climate pollutants, will bring short-term gains. Now this is very important to understand because we need to make sure that at no point the world moves away from its focus on carbon dioxide. Because only when we reduce carbon dioxide do we get any long-term gains. But you do get short-term gains if you reduce short-lived pollutants. If you look at this chart, which is I have borrowed from Anumita, which she has borrowed from someone, but she uses a lot, shows very clearly the baseline if you were to do business as usual with CO2, if you were to do it with methane and black carbon measures, and if you were to do it with all other short-lived. So if you look at this green, this is really what they're looking at. So you can bring in some difference, not a lot. 75% of the emissions still belong to carbon dioxide. So if you don't do anything about carbon dioxide, forget it, we are blown. But what you have is an opportunity to reduce these emissions and bring short-term gains. So what is black carbon? Black carbon, very simply, is a product of incomplete combustion. It is about burning fuel in cook stoves. It's about what comes out of diesel cars. What comes out of brick kilns. It's a fraction of the tiny PM 2.5 particle that we in Delhi love to talk about. It's bad for our health. If inhaled, it is deadly, so it is a local pollutant. I said it has a very small life, a few hours to a few days, but it has climate impacts. When it is in the atmosphere, it absorbs heat and warms the surrounding atmosphere. If you look at the latest IPCC report, AR5, it is double the estimate of warming, the radiative forcing of black carbon from fossil fuel and biofuels from previous reports. So essentially, we are getting to understand more and more that there is a local pollutant called black carbon, which comes out of our diesel cars, but it also has global problems. And that's really what our meeting here is about. If you look at PM, which is particulate matter, the story I talked of from Delhi, it comes out of all combustion processes, all dust generating activities, secondary particulates, it has nitrates and sulfates. Black carbon is a part of PM 2.5. It's essentially about incomplete combustion. So if you look at this diesel, the black carbon, it brings the global and the local pollution together. It's at the core of the diesel particulate matter. So now the question is, what does the world do with this? It has two options, and CSC has been seeing the world floundering on this matter for the last few years. It has seen terrible geopolitics emerge, complete incompetence and ineptitude on the part of global negotiators, particularly northern negotiators, in handling this issue with any sensitivity. So you can turn this entire agenda into an agenda against the poor. You can use black carbon, the chula smoke that you have from women who burn fuel in their chulas. You can say they are the ones who are responsible for climate change now. We need to do something about chulas in the world because they are the ones who will bring us any benefit when it comes to reducing climate change. That's the kind of language that started emerging in the world in the last few years. And we've watched it with some amount of worry and concern, because all that would just mean that you would shift responsibility and the burden, and you would buy time. You would see this to buy time so that you can continue to run SUVs and do everything that you do with your emissions and not reduce them. You shift the burden. On the other hand, as I said, there is an opportunity. You can work with the poor. You can see an opportunity to leapfrog, to clean energy, to clean housing, and to clean air for all. Now that's what this dialogue is about. The Anil Agarwal 2015 dialogue. We are putting the poor in climate change at the center. We are demanding, and we are hoping that that's what we will discuss and build consensus on. How do we turn the world to look at this agenda in a way that becomes the opportunity for change and not another obstacle? But then we need to internalize the politics. There are three elements of the politics. I've mentioned these before, but I want to put them firmly on the table. The first politics is we cannot allow this agenda to distract from the world cutting CO2. It cannot be a proxy for action on climate change. It cannot take away the burden, the historical burden of the rich for reducing emissions. The second politics is that this action must differentiate between luxury emissions and survival emissions, even when it comes to short-lived climate pollutants. Why do I say this? Because if you look at it, on the one hand, there is diesel, which leads to black carbon, which is emitted by the rich of the world. Rich in India, rich in Germany, rich in Europe, rich in the United States. On the other hand, there are cook stoves which emit black carbon, though there is a greater amount of white black carbon in that, not so much black. Organic matter is higher, which means that they don't have such major impacts, but nevertheless, you still have cook stoves, and that needs to be seen as a survival emission and needs some supportive policies. So on one hand, you need to have aggressive action against luxury SLCPs. On the other hand, supportive action against survival SLCPs. And the third issue, which is becoming a very big issue, which we hope we will discuss and come up with some recommendations at the end of tomorrow, is how will this country action on black carbon, which is not part of the Kyoto package, should not be part of the Kyoto 6 package, which is the package of greenhouse gases, how will countries account for it? We do not want countries to be accounting for this within the climate change package. Yet we want countries to be taking advantage of the co-benefit agenda. How will this happen? That's a big issue that we have, that we hope we will discuss. But the opportunity is what we shouldn't lose sight of. The opportunity is to move the world from non-fossil to non-fossil. Let's be very clear in this room. We are all part of the problem. We are all part of the problem, perhaps at varying degree, but we are all part of the problem. If at all you and I are able to breathe today, we don't have climate change happening at the speed. It's only because there are large numbers of people in the world who are not part of the fossil fuel present right now. The women who cook on old, dirty, inefficient, polluting cook stoves are part of how the world counts renewable energy. So they do renewable energy. The new renewable energy, the solar, the wind, is still a small part of the world. The large part of the world is the women who actually still use polluting cook stoves. The question that we have is, do they take the next step and move to LPG and be part of the fossil present, like you and me? They will add to the climate burden, like you and me. They will use cleaner energy, like you and me. They will reduce their own health burden because of that clean fuel. Or can they move to solar mini grids which provide electricity for cooking? So can they actually move way beyond moving the trajectory so that they go from non-fossil to non-fossil? That's the opportunity that exists in the world. And the challenge then is to reinvent and reinvent and reinvent. Because the one thing that we at CSC are clear, and we hope that we will convince all of you as well, is that we cannot really take the route to improve the efficiency and pollution impact of each appliance. The entire world is obsessed about cleaning its cars and putting in hybrid cars. The world is obsessed about cleaning cook stoves or cleaning brick kilns. The question that we have, which we will discuss over the next 2 days, is, are these strategies working? Are these enough? Or do we need transformational solutions so that we can have mobility for all, clean energy access for all, and affordable and sustainable building material for all? Let's be very clear. Brick kilns are essential if you're talking about affordable housing. So what is the alternative that brings affordability on the table and yet brings sustainable building material? Do we have those transformational answers? And how will we work together in the local, global compact to do this? Because global needs local. And the question now is, how do we make sure this co-benefit agenda actually happens? It's better informed, it's better positioned. And that's what I hope we'll deliberate in the next 2 days so that we can find a common way to push forward. Thank you very much.